Hey there team, welcome back to the channel and welcome to my overview of Path of Exile 2. So, ordinarily I do overviews on this channel where I have a look at the first 2 hours of a game, I have a whole spiel around it. It's a little bit different when you're dealing with games with unusual pricings and releases, i.e. this is going to be free to play but it's not at the moment, sort of pay to get into a little premium, but we'll get into that. But broadly speaking, I've played it for about 4 hours now, poking and prodding different classes, trying to figure out where I sit. So I'm just going to share some thoughts, some observations with it as a real normie, right? I am absolutely not an authority on Path of Exile. I played a chunk of it, especially in the early days, but it's a huge investment. It's one of those games that you could only play this as, you know, a hobby, and it's going to be the same thing with number 2. So if you are like me and maybe you got a bit overwhelmed and fell away from Path of Exile, nothing against its quality or anything like that, arguably because there's so much going on with the way they did seasonal content, seems like a pretty good time to jump in and get involved with Path of Exile 2 at the ground level. So yes, to cover off on the release, right now you can pay a premium to join early access, or at least this is how the studio's putting it. $45 Australian, something like that. I'm happy to fork out and pay for it because of the pedigree of the studio. I don't think it's such a wild take to say that Path of Exile 1 being a free-to-play game is probably one of the most player-centric, consumer-friendly exchanges you could have. You could easily play thousands of hours in Path of Exile 1 and never pay a cent and never have your gameplay throttled or hurt around it. It seems to live on the back of cosmetics. And so I think that's why it's kind of doing gangbusters. It earned players' trust. And so many people like myself are happy to just pay to get involved in number 2. However, I believe it's 6 to 12 months. I'm not sure if there's a firm date, but it's not anytime soon when the game goes into its full release. And I'm still not even sure if that's a version of early access itself or it will be its 1.0. At that point, it's going to be free. So if you don't necessarily want to fork out or anything like that, or maybe you're not that interested, I'd even suggest just play Path of Exile 1. Get familiar with it, and then when this goes free to play and it's got all the kinks ironed out, you can jump on it then. So yes, an unusual, almost back to front payment, but again, it's a real tragedy that this game studio is one of the only ones that has the trust of consumers, and therefore it's doing quite well on this unusual trust-based model. So as far as the actual game goes, at the moment there are 6 classes that you can pick from. Some of them are carryover from the old game, some of them are totally new. I think it's going to be 12 at full release, which is pretty cool. If you compare it to the first game and the sphere grid system, you essentially have sort of 6 spokes on the grid. And when you compare that to the 3 core stats of strength, intelligence and agility, I think that's their names, blue, red and green, and then hybrids in between them. So half strength, half evasion, agility. That's how the structure of the classes played out in the original game. It's not really 1-to-1 here, though I feel like it will once the 12 are released. For example, you have Sorceress and Witch in this, and they are both kind of pure blue, albeit one's more spells and the other one's more like minions, but they're occupying the same sort of class overlap, which is unusual. A couple of things, because again, I haven't gone very far into it, and I've started different characters just to see, right? To see what's going on and the differences. There are a couple of big focus points in this game worth mentioning. One, WASD control has been added, and it works outrageously well in certain circumstances. I wouldn't have thought that it would. I think there are a lot of people that will stubbornly refuse to try it because they are ARPG purists, but for some of the classes it works really well, and it's going to be a tough ask for me to go back to them. Now this will also mix into another point, which is boss battles, and that the sort of interplay is much more action oriented, and you can't really get away with it from mouse clicking as much as you can go on WASD, hitting spacebar to dodge around and essentially moving your character separate of where you're clicking, if that makes sense. At the forefront, there's this character called the Mercenary, who is sort of who I've settled on maining just because they kind of tie in with this gimmick, which again, I feel is very powerful. And it's essentially a gunplay crossbow dude. So he plays as a totally different, almost active action character where you're shooting dudes, hosing dudes, whether it's more rapid fire armor piercing or, shrapnel explosive shots, more like fire and refire every shot. The dodging interplay with WASD controls for your character. Incredibly unique. Very much not Path of Exile, and yet in execution and balance, it's right at home. So I would insist that you give it a go at least. Boot up a character and give it a go to see what it's about, or try switching the control scheme, because some of the other ones I found didn't work so well, like the Warrior, which was added in. Even his starting gem, which has this sort of extended juggle double attack ability, I found that kind of works so much better with mouse click. So there are some characters and some builds that it's just the control style will marry better with them. But even the the Sorceress, I was giving a bit of a go, and she's sort of got these little electric, not quite eels, but they just spoke out and crawl around and all. And I found moving Wazda around while firing that off to sort of area attack things was actually really cool as well. So yeah, that's the really big thing. Second big thing is boss battles that I've noticed. There are a couple of bosses littered out throughout the world. A lot of the structure and flow of this is very similar to Path of Exile 1. Move through a biome, there will be like a path through to the next biome, but there'll probably be a side area or like a cave system. But then on top of that, there's usually a couple of bosses found in the wild, so you're rewarded for exploring that space. And my goodness, they're so cool. And they fight more like I don't want to use the tired Elden Ring, Dark Souls example, but like spectacle boss fights with move sets that you have to interact with. And this is only in the first few levels, like sub-level 10. So I can only imagine how dense and how many more there are going to be. And that's the huge carrot on the stick for me, is wanting to see these interesting boss battles. I fought this cool one, like he brambled off the area, and it didn't have the most complex telegraphs, but you can see that at the first instance, like these are the first few intro bosses, and they're complicated enough, you can sort of see where it's going to go in the future. And that, again, talk the mercenary interplay, dodging around with spacebar and moving around. It works so well when combined with these complicated bosses. And then the third really big takeaway for me is they have more of an ability interplay focus in this game. And it's probably the really biggest core thesis that's different from the first game. Like, they've overhauled all the skill gems and how they work. And I actually really like this system. I'm not going to go too granular into it because, again, I'm very normie. I don't want to talk outside of my expertise. But the way that the gem system is slots is fresh, but it has a huge focus not just on augmenting skills, because that's always been a thing in Path of Exile, but like I said, the interplay between skills. Now, some examples you would have seen in trailers that you can sort of do earlier. I mentioned the Sorceress. She's got these little electric wormy things that crawl around, that zip around indiscriminately all over the place. If you put up a firewall and zap them and they go through that, they inherit fire damage. You can see that on the animation as well. So a bit of a chaotic simulator. The mercenary that I put more time into has an option. You can do these two different ammo types, fragmentation and, I don't know, ice, frozen, whatever. And what you would do, because I was doing him, I hotkey like Q on the shoulder as frost and E as fragmentation. And the fragmentation has sort of addendum secondary text saying that if you impact a frozen enemy with that, it'll detonate, explode, shatter. Essentially an explosion. Does a lot of damage. It's a huge payoff. And so you would get into this muscle memory cycle of dumping ice rounds on dudes until they freeze up, and then you basically quick reload into the fragmentation, fire that into the frozen dude and detonate, and then go back, rinse and repeat. Mix all that in with the more movement while you're firing. That's very difficult to describe, but like you can be using Wazda to step away from enemies whilst you're hosing them. Even when I played the witch, doing that with her little bloody Harry Potter wand was actually quite rewarding. Not really something you can do with mouse clicking. You kind of, in that moment when you're attacking, you're static. In this, you can keep moving. But anyway, the focus on that sort of interplay is Really cool. And then you marry that into like the boss fights, the bramble dude I was talking about, trying to freeze him and then detonate him. Very interesting stuff. I've now moved into a different sort of build because I'm experimenting, kind of going grenade ballistic with this mercenary. I've got it ricocheting all over the place, lots of different, smaller, more grenades but smaller explosions, that sort of thing. Anyway, this is just more of a recounting of my anecdotal experience with it. I'm impressed. There's enough here that's different to give it a go. The whole reason I even really gave it a go in the first place was because I saw the trailers. They've got this sort of Mesoamerican Aztec-y horror setting, and it's really grimdark, and it kind of feels a bit smaller scale than the first game, which is wild because grimdark was part of the first game anyway. But even I've moved into a biome recently, it's like forests, and it's very dark and oppressive, and there is just a feel to it that resonates a lot more with me than the first game. Not that there was anything wrong with the first game, but it's a mixture of the art direction and just overall world design. I find a much bigger investment for me personally. Anyway, these are my early thoughts on Path of Exile 2. It's very cool, it's worth checking out, or at the very least, putting on your radar, wish listing, keep an eye on it for the release so you can pick it up free. Anyway team, might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.